This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. School districts nationwide have been vastly underreporting instances when some of their most vulnerable students are physically restrained or sent to seclusion rooms by campus staff. That's the conclusion of a new report from the Government Accountability Office, a federal watchdog agency. But two reporters on opposite sides of the country have already been deep into the reporting on this issue in recent months. Jenny Abamu of WAMU in Washington, D.C., and Rob Manning of Oregon Public Broadcasting. They're both with us now. Jenny, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
And Rob, we're very glad to have you here making your EWA Radio debut.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Rob, you and Jenny both work for NPR affiliates, and you co-produced a recent story looking at the use of restraint and seclusion in your respective school districts. How did this tag team project come about?
It happened sort of by accident. As you said, we're NPR member station reporters, and we were both on a call a few months ago, which we have every week, and not every week am I on it. Probably not every week is Jenny on it. But on this call, we were both on it. And we were just going around saying what stories we were working on. And Jenny started describing the research that she'd been doing and the reporting she'd been doing into the schools in Fairfax, Virginia, and particularly the issue of seclusion and restraint of students with disabilities. And my jaw dropped as I was listening to her because I'm like, she is basically doing the same story that I've been doing out of the Vancouver, Washington schools and schools in Oregon, and finding similar but somewhat different things. And so as she was talking, I was like, should I be interrupting her, jumping in and saying, hey, I'm doing that story too? But as it turned out later, we had a conversation and connected with the editor, Nicole Cohen, after the call and, just kind of worked on it really separately in our two places and then brought our reporting together in a way that I think really worked.
Jenny, what did you think about that synergy? What were you able to accomplish sort of overlapping here?
I actually was super excited when Rob interrupted, because not interrupted, but came in while we were discussing the project, because then we were able to say, okay, this is a national issue that needs to be addressed. And we just so happened to be addressing this at the same time. And also we both had very, very strong long form stories that we had done for our member stations on it. And so bringing it together for a national audience, it was just kind of nice in multiple ways. For one, I mostly covered seclusion and Rob mostly covered restraints. And then also, in addition to that, I was on the East Coast and Rob was on the West Coast. So it kind of was very expansive in what we were able to do with both of our work.
So just to make sure our listeners understand what we're talking about, let's get into those definitions and we'll break them out the way you just did. Jenny, what do we mean when you're saying seclusion?
So to seclude a student means to basically isolate them. You are isolating them and not allowing them to move on their own free will. And so that can be in a makeshift corner. Some seclusion spaces I've seen look like kind of like timeout. They look like they're in the side of a classroom or in a hallway, and basically the student is somehow separated from the rest of the group. And they're in these like corners, usually in the makeshift corners, so you can still see out of the room. There's usually nothing covering the top of where the kid is. But in Fairfax County, the seclusion rooms are very different. And also in Montgomery County, places like that. In those places, seclusion rooms are like closets. And they're usually like rooms within rooms. And within the room, it's all cement. And there's no windows on the walls. There are like two little slits on the door, and there's a large mechanical lock that locks from the outside. It really does look like solitary confinement spaces.
And Rob, when we talk about restraint, that means possibly because they believe it's the only way to keep a child from hurting themselves, physically holding them back somehow. What are they doing?
That's right. I mean, the technical definition is kind of more expansive than what really happens most of the time. There are chemical restraints, there are mechanical restraints, but in the vast majority, or really all the cases that I investigated, and I think probably Jenny too, we're talking about physical restraint, which is basically grabbing a kid, holding a kid in a way that the kid is not necessarily interested in being held in that way. The way it's written in law at the federal level and often at the state level is restraint, and really seclusion is only meant to be done in cases where the student, him or herself, is posing a safety risk, or they're posing a safety risk to staff or to other students. And certainly one of the big concerns among parents is that it's not just used in those instances, that it's used for punishment, that it's used, preemptively long before a child is actually posing much of a danger. But the rule is restraint is defined by holding a kid in a way that keeps them from free movement, and it's supposed to be done basically for safety reasons.
One of the issues you looked at in your reporting was whether parents were being appropriately notified when their children were being secluded or restrained. What did you find?
In both Washington and Oregon, part of the state law is that parents are supposed to be notified within 24 hours or by the end of the school day, if at all possible. And that means a phone call. That means talking to them when they show up to school to pick up the kid. It means, an email. Some kind of notification is supposed to happen as soon as possible. And that's often supposed to be followed by a conversation, a discussion of like, this is what happened. How can we help make sure this doesn't happen again? And what I found in my reporting is time after time, this is not happening, that parents are not finding out about it. They're finding out about it because they see marks and bruises on their kids when they come home. And that is not the way the law is supposed to work. And Washington, I think, could be held up as an example of a place that actually has pretty strict reporting requirements. And they publish the numbers of restraints that happen every year down to the school level. But how much of that really is helpful if parents are not actually being told? And also, does that suggest that when parents aren't being told, there's also underreporting on the official end as well?
Jenny, you reported that Fairfax County originally told the federal government that they had 0 instances of seclusion and restraint for a particular reporting period. Now they're saying that number is 1,700, and you say it could be even higher. How did that kind of a gap happen?
What I understand from them is that there's a system breakdown, really. At the school level, there's been reporting issues with individual teachers, there's been reporting issues. And then also at the district level, there's reporting issues. And the reality is, when you report 0 every single time, it's an area that people assume is nothing's going on there anyway. When I started my reporting on this topic, I originally glanced over Fairfax County because I cover regionally, so I cover Maryland, Virginia, and DC. And so I was just curious how often seclusion and restraint happened because I never heard of that before happening in schools. And when I looked at the numbers, Fairfax County, I was like, okay, 0, not going to worry about that. Loudoun County had like 6, which is another place in Northern Virginia. DC had about 14. And then Montgomery County had about 1,600 or something very large like that. And so I initially went to Montgomery County and I told those officials, I was like, guys, are you sure this number's right? It's got to be wrong, right? Because this is way off in comparison to the rest of the surrounding areas. And, when I went in and talked to them and they described to me what seclusion and restraint looked like, then I understood that there's no way a county as large as Fairfax could have 0 for 10 years. It's just not logical statistically. And so when I reached out to a few groups and asked them, what have you all been hearing, particularly special education groups, because we knew that was based on the available data. We know that it mostly happens to boys and students with disabilities. Then people started to pour out with stories.
You reported on the review from the Federal Government Accountability Office. One of their conclusions was that if a district said they had 0 instances of seclusion and restraint, now's a good time to go back and ask them to check those numbers again. What else is the GAO recommending?
So the report has given 4 different recommendations to the Department of Education. And most of the recommendations, in summary, basically tell the Department of Ed, hey, follow up, do oversight, right? Because part of what they're doing with this data is they're making policies from this data. Earlier this year in February, there was a congressional hearing about what this data was telling congressional officials and other legislative bodies. And part of what they saw, initially, the GAO opened their statement by saying, hey, this is rare. This doesn't really happen that often in public schools. And now they're saying, actually, we don't know how often this is happening because the data is really bad. And so we can't make conclusions from it. They can't figure out if they're going to legislate, whether they need to legislate this issue. There's a lot of questions that can't be answered because the data is so bad. And so they've told the Department of Education to, hey, make sure you follow up. especially the larger districts with over 100,000 students inside of them, that if they're reporting zero for things, that you're making sure that they're actually zeros. Does that zero really mean that? And then making sure that they put in action plans. So if you're not collecting the data, what are you going to do in the future to start collecting this data? What are you going to do to make sure that you're meeting your mandates? And so that's also another issue that they're talking about. And then the third part, there was kind of a debate between the two groups about correcting past year's data. And, in Ed's defense, it is a lot of districts. There's 1,700 districts. 70% are reporting zero. That's a lot of school districts to go back and say, hey, this might be wrong. Can you fix it? And try to fix it all. And so part of what they're saying instead is maybe if you don't fix it, maybe you should mark it as unreliable, that people cannot use this data to do research, to make policy, lots of things like that. And that's what they're doing with it right now. And so in that recommendation, they haven't heard back from the Department of Ed. And I also asked them, I was like, guys, is this reliable? Will you say, in your opinion, is it reliable? First, they said yes. Now they're kind of dancing around the answer. So it is still kind of up in the air about the fourth recommendation.
We're talking with Rob Manning of Oregon Public Broadcasting and Jenny Abamu of WAMU about their investigation into the use of restraint and seclusion on students in public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Rob, how should reporters handle a call from a parent or guardian who says that their child has been improperly secluded or restrained? Where do they start?
Well, I think certainly, getting as much information as possible from whoever parent who calls, because they are going to have probably as much information as anybody about what the incident actually was. And then the difficulty in getting information from a school, and, education reporters run into this all the time, is that basically FERPA gets in the way, the federal law protecting student information. And so one of the steps that often is most helpful is for parents to get whatever information they can get from the school and then hand it over to the reporter. It's the easiest way I've found to get around FERPA. I mean, there should be records, certainly, of things like suspensions and expulsions. There should also be records of actual incidents of restraint and seclusion. If there are not, then often parents are going to have doctor's reports or other medical reports that basically show something happened and it didn't happen at home. So putting two and two together, what was going on in school? Virtually all the parents that I spoke to for the stories that I did on restraint and seclusion had filed official complaints. And often that triggers an investigation by the school district. And that is often information that, again, the parent can get, but a reporter often can't get because of FERPA.
And I just want to touch on one more thing on what Rob said, too, just to kind of back that up. Like, one thing to do, and I notice is tough for a lot of parents, sometimes parents don't want to admit some of the things that their kids have done. So if you can get your hand on documents from the school, just to be fair to the teachers about what is happening in those spaces, please try and get them, and also ask the parents for them, because sometimes you'll read it and you'll be like, oh, this was a tough situation. And you got to be fair to the teachers who are dealing with those students, and just make sure that when you say, okay, what kind of things got this kid restrained or got this kid secluded? Was it that he was really, out of control, he or she, or and they were, really hurting everyone around them and the teacher had no choice? Or was it that, they just were non-compliant? I saw a bit of both.
Jenny, I'm curious, what have been particularly fruitful data searches for you on this project?
Data is hard in this sector because nobody wants to talk about this. And you won't even find a lot of research on it because it's even harder for researchers to get into those spaces. Like, what we had to do really was a ground job. I went from house to house to house to get documentation from as many families as that had it about how many times their children were secluded. And the documentation that is there is a good starting place, but just note that there's probably a lot of errors with that documentation, at least on the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights data portal. You can start there. It is a good place to start. And sometimes it is worth just pointing out, hey, there's nothing here. Because I think that the story, that's what was surprising for me. Sometimes you're looking for outliers in ways that are like, these are really high numbers. But instead, especially with Fairfax County, the outlier is that Fairfax was reporting 0, which is a very low number. And so keeping your mind open about what you're looking for when you look for an outlier, but also keeping in mind that, you're looking at data sets, you're looking for patterns, and also keeping in mind the size of the district that you're looking at. What's normal? We shouldn't be comparing, Arlington, which is a tiny school district in the DC area, to like Fairfax County, right? That doesn't make sense to compare those two because they're very different sizes. But if you look at maybe Fairfax County and Montgomery County or some other places, those are similar size, very large districts. And so kind of keeping in mind that if you're saying, oh, this school has so many or this state has so many, making sure you keep it in a fair comparison. But yeah, most of the data that you're going to get on seclusion and restraint, at least, is probably going to come from parents or schools. That will be most accurate if you can get that.
Bob, what are some of the voices reporters should be mindful to include in these kinds of stories, especially the ones who might be overlooked?
Well, I think one type of employee at the school level that is good to talk to are, they're sometimes called paraeducators or educational assistants. They're people who work really exclusively with students with special needs or disabled students. They, often work one-on-one or in small groups, and they are very often the staff who actually do the restraint or do the restraint to seclusion, as it often works. And they have stories of their own about how they've been hit and had their hair pulled and been bitten. And I think it's important to remember that, these are physical confrontations, sometimes between big kids, or at least, out of control kids that have more strength than you might imagine, and, just folks who are trying to be educators. So as much as, certainly this is a tough story certainly with kids in the middle, there are school staff who put themselves in some ways put themselves at risk. And I think they're certainly worth talking to. They are sometimes reluctant to talk because, I think there's a certain amount of feeling of failure or, shame that they have had to do multiple restraints on certain children. But, there's a certain part of this that it kind of comes with their job.
Jenny, what advice do you have for reporters when it comes to being sensitive to families and children with special needs?
Always, of course, try and learn the terminology and be as respectful as possible with that. Also, balancing the terminology that some people may want with also what people will understand generally in a respectful way. I think that's really important. And then making time for them. I think one thing that even sometimes I didn't realize how much time I would need with some of these families to get through their stories. I would spend hours, with some people just letting them talk. Some of these people that I spoke with, they told me that they were telling me things they had never told their closest friends. And so when they opened that box, it was for them almost a therapeutic process. And so I had to be patient to let them get through that process. And there were parents that I chose not to use their stories, but I did want their documentation because I needed that for my story. I didn't need to put every parent in the front of the paper because it's embarrassing for them. And it's also embarrassing for the school. For example, one parent, her child was, secluded over 400 times in a 3-year period. For that parent, she was embarrassed because she blamed herself for allowing it to happen. So like talking to those parents and figuring out like if they're really okay about going on the record, because people will attack them online. Some people don't mind and they're ready to take it. And she really was at that point. She was like, I don't care what people say. I want to tell this story. But there were also parents who wanted to tell the story, but were deeply afraid for multiple reasons. And in this case, Fairfax County did pay a lot of settlements for families. And so they were concerned that they might lose their settlement and their child would have to go back to the school. For those people who were like single mothers, that was very difficult for them. They were very afraid of losing the deal that they had with Fairfax County and maybe ending back up in court and things like that. And so for them, I just got their documents and I got their story on record just to make sure that the pattern matched the other stories. And then I didn't use their tape or anything or even their names because it just wasn't worth it. I didn't need to put them in harm's way to do that story.
I'd love to hear from both of you a story idea or two for local reporters who may want to follow your lead and look at the use of restraint and seclusion in their own communities. Rob, let's start with you.
Well, I think one thing, you can start with the civil rights data and understand that it is bad data. Say if any of those 9 large school districts that have reported 0 incidents are in your coverage area, then that is right there worth looking into. Like, okay, what are the real numbers? And see if you can do any kind of, search on records that they would have, internal communication that they might have. Obviously not asking for individual student names, but asking for just, what kind of record keeping do they do internally? Because I know that was part of what Jenny was able to do with Fairfax County, was get to sort of what the internal communication was. I think that's a good way to go. Another good resource that might point a reporter in a good direction is that I know the Education Commission for the states has a breakdown of what the laws are in various states. And some states have done more work on this lately than others. Connecticut's done work. I know Washington and Oregon have certainly changed their laws in the last few years. So just looking at, what's the direction that they are headed. And I think to the extent that, the education department is going to be reaching out to states and school districts to say, hey, what's going on with your data? Whatever you can do to find out what those conversations are, like, are any of your school districts being contacted by the Federal Education Agency? That would be a story, I would think.
Jenny, an idea from you.
I will say, following up on the idea of the records on all of those things, I think that's a really great place to start, only because if your system isn't collecting records and there's a breakdown of records, that oftentimes means a breakdown of oversight. So I do think that if there is a records issue, you'll probably also find oversight issues. For me, that's just a very obvious tipping off point. And then I think the other thing to think about is also solution stories. I don't like to leave people in doom and gloom. And especially with this population, students who have different learning needs and things like that, there are people who are learning ways to work with these kids. There are people who dedicate their life and their research to understanding how to better serve these students, and tapping those people so that your story doesn't end with just, oh, terrible things are happening, but also ends with, it doesn't have to be this way. I think it's just really important. And then also, seclusion and restraint is an entryway to like a lot of things. One other thing to think about is, who is secluding and restraining the kids? Is it the PAs who work there, or is it the security officers? That's something that I've heard a lot about, is security officers actually doing this restraints on students and not being documented. And so that might be worth noting if it's happening with other people, and those people might not have the same, wherewithal as educators do about children and things like that. And so that might be something to also note. And then also context is great. I think that that's something I haven't gotten into as much as I want to, because it's just, there's a lot going on. But thinking about, why is this system breaking down? If we're not recording what's happening in the school, why are we not recording it? Where is the system breaking down? What's going on with the context of the school area? What's going on with the training? What's going on with all of these things that surround seclusion and restraint? And that might lead you to other stories outside of seclusion and restraint, because that's more of a systems issue. Is there a budget issue? Is somebody misusing the budget? Like, what's going on in the system that this dark space is not being addressed?
Jenny Abamu covers education for WAMU. She previously reported for EdSurge, Columbia University's EdLab, and New York One News Channel. Rob Manning became a news editor at Oregon Public Broadcasting earlier this year after about 15 years on the education beat, both covering schools and universities in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Jenny and Rob, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.